like to skip real quick to personalization and just touch briefly on it, because we're talking about intelligent agents here, which is, creating content experiences that are ultimately conversational and intuitive. And Nicole's talking about creating authoring and delivery content lifecycle, content supply chain interactions that are intuitive and intelligent. And Michael's talked about, augmenting what humans do with Gen AI in a way that allows for there to be a real fusion between human intelligence and these assistant technologies that can help draft and validate and do some of these review cycles. So we're talking about creating a much more kind of kinetic, intelligent supply chain, as well as a number of intelligent agents out the other side are interacting both in terms of written output, long form text, but also dialogue-based interactions with customers, ultimately. That starts to get into this realm of, well, in order to be intelligent, systems need to have context and their dialogue. So there's in-session context of what the user's asking, but then there's also this whole other world of personalization that's been worked towards for years. It's a little bit of a mythological beast. All of us have dealt with different levels of ambition with personalization and what is actually realized. But just really, really briefly, what is working with data-driven personalization that you've seen in digital experience composition and delivery? Maybe Mark, we can start with you. And Nicole, I know you've been exposed to a lot of that as well. So let's just touch real briefly on that.
Yeah, the one area where I have seen a lot of success is very much around B2B and account-based marketing, and particularly using tools like 6th Sense. For those that don't know what it is, it essentially has a big database of IP addresses and companies. And so if you're visiting a website, you'll know, oh, you're coming from this company and you're in this industry and you have this type of revenue. And it's used a lot by sales folks on the B2B side, particularly SDRs and doing outbound outreach. And that's extremely successful. I think everybody that we've talked to that's implemented it, including when I was at Uniform internally, has a high degree of success with it, especially relative to other personalization tactics. And so, it is limited to that particular spot within that domain, but it is one of those things that I've seen that has been effective.
Okay, so it's an account-based marketing, working with data aggregators and then delivering content against those profiles that are IP-based ultimately. So that's great. So there's a reverse IP lookup, there's an understanding of the user, there's some data that's being ingested, and then there's some content being delivered against that. So some assumptions can be made, and then some follow-up can happen on the sales team. Other thoughts on how real personalization is, and I know there's a lot of efforts within Headless that are oriented towards personalization.
Well, I think Mark's example is a really good one because it's providing specific information within a very clear context, and it's clear who it's going to, for what purpose, and how to use it. I think what's challenging as we try to extend that on a larger scale is that that's still a very small slice of what your audience is actually doing. And I think that the challenge with personalization is that it really is all about context, and it's context that's meaningful for the recipient on the other end, i.e. your customer or whoever else your audience might be. And as we try to get fancier and fancier in what we're doing with personalization, the challenge is that every new variable that we're introducing, we're making really big assumptions. And so the likelihood that we're going to be off the mark is therefore larger and larger the more and more complex we try to get with this stuff. So what I see that is effective is actually getting the very simple stuff right. It's knowing something about who your audience is and having a very clear understanding of what they are highly likely to be interested in. And that is going to be a combination of things. One is something that is directly relevant based on probably first-party information that you have about them, who they are, what they've bought from you in the past, what else they've received from you, what sort of customer service calls, for example, they have into you. So a very clear, very high-fidelity view of what kinds of communications or interactions you already had with someone. And the other is the potential that they're going to be interested in something that you're offering to them. And again, that is based on what I would call high-fidelity information. And it might not be totally deterministic. You might be, making some conjectures here, but you're not getting into a very broad set of variables that you're trying to use to determine what you're personalizing for them. So I would say, as a general rule of thumb, even with all of the great technologies we have, simpler is better, because without a really rich composite view of who you're interacting with, there's way too much opportunity to be wrong. And the fact of the matter is, we never know when we piss off a customer to the point that they don't want to interact with us again. We don't have a way of collecting that data, but we know it happens. We all know it from our personal experiences as consumers. That's one part of this. I think there's another interesting part of personalization that we really don't talk a lot about, which is potentially a whole other discussion, which is not just how we're tailoring information in order to try to anticipate and meet an individual need, but how are we actually creating what feels like a very personal connection with the customers and audiences we want to reach. And the interesting thing to me about that is that it's a lot less about personalization technologies, and it's a lot more about how we're thinking about and constructing the kinds of experiences for some specific customer segments or groups that we know and understand in the places where they are, in ways that are really meaningful and relevant, because those are the things that actually feel personal. So there's a real distinction between what we call personalization, what actually feels like a personal connection.
Yeah,
I have a great example of getting that wrong, actually. And this was where they had the technology in place, and somebody that we all know. So it was an airline was using something like 6 Sense to be able to identify the company. And it was, I believe, Christina Halverson had visited the United.com, and it said like, "Hi, Brain Traffic," which is a company name, book a plane ticket. And she's like, "Okay, well, what value is this adding? None. It's showing off. It's basically using this tool to do a mail merge on a website," which is, the tool's great. I love 6 Sense. I just talked it up. But unless you're thinking about, to your point, Nicole, the context or what she's actually trying to achieve or build some personal connection, you can do it in a way that is completely flat-footed and ultimately self-defeating.
Yeah, so there's a human design, factor to this. There's a lot of UX orientation advocates who would want there to be a customer journey map and these cohorts or personas understood. And then you look at the data. You have data partners who say, well, how do we really serve these cohorts? And then going to get down to that level of crafting a strategy and then working with content technology to deliver against that strategy. But that requires, again, this level of organizational awareness, this cross-functional content strategy that is part of a bigger customer and market strategy that really can then impact the technology choices. And that's not always the way that these projects happen. A lot of times it starts with a product team that needs to get a certain campaign into market, and they buy a piece of tech and it has some personalization capabilities, and then they're looking to how do they use those. And so it kind of inverse, rolls into production. And so the same thing happens with content models. You kind of build a design, and then the content model is inferred from the design, and we don't have anything reusable at the end of the day. It's all just for that campaign, for that product, for that one instance. So you're doing instance-based deployments with strategy and unified process as a backwater, or isn't even in the picture. And so that creates incoherent effects over time, right? And that compounds. And so personalization efforts can contribute to siloization and bifurcation of these environments, or it can be part of a coherent, bigger strategy, but it goes to that question of sponsorship.